the blessing of forgiveness. And we're going to be looking at Psalm 32. It's in your newsletter. This picture behind me is of Nathan, the prophet, confronting King David. David had committed adultery with Bathsheba while his army was away. She becomes pregnant. He has to rid himself of the inconvenient truth of Uriah, one of his bravest soldiers. And he felt that he had got it all tidied away. But God, it says at the end of chapter 11 of 2 Samuel, but God was not pleased. He sends Nathan to King David to tell him about a man who had a poor man who had a sheep, a lamb that he had raised almost as a daughter. So precious was it, despite his poverty. But a rich man who had many sheep decided that when they came to entertain the visitors, he would use the poor man's lamb, not one of his own flocks. After all, it's such good quality. What better honour to give to visitors than to use this poor man's lamb? Well, this incensed David, that such a man might exist. And he says he deserves to die. Not that he would actually execute him, but he deserves to die. But he should pay back 4 times, and however it says there in chapter 12. But that's when Nathan says those devastating words, "You are that man." And David's world collapses. It's interesting that the moment that David thought would destroy him became the moment that God used to restore him. And forgiveness, it's the blessing we all need. The psalm begins in a surprising way in verses 1 and 2. Blessed is the one whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. There are 3 words here for sin. First of all, there's transgression. There's the word sin, and in verse 2, there's the word iniquity. But there's also 3 expressions for forgiveness. There is forgiven or lifted, covered, and in verse 2, not counted. You see, our true blessing doesn't come through self-esteem or success or counselling or achievement. True blessing comes through knowing a God who does not count our sin against him. And this is the wonderful truth, of course, of Christ that God reveals to us in the New Testament. That the greatest blessing in life is to be forgiven by God. Verse 2, blessed is the man against whom the Lord counts no iniquity, and in whose sin there is no deceit. It is the blessing we all need. Sin, though, is a burden we cannot carry. And we see in verses 3 and 4 the cost of keeping silent. David tried to live with unconfessed sin. I don't know if you've tried to do that, and whether your experience is the same as David here in verse 3 and 4. For when I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was dried up as by the heat of summer. His bones were wasting away. His strength was dried up. David felt that he had covered over his sin. Here we see something of the troubled conscience of David before Nathan confronted him. You see, it was more than simply him feeling guilty, wasn't it? In verse 4, it was your heavy hand upon me. To be convicted of our sin is not an experience of God abandoning us, but of God pursuing us. A hidden sin always becomes a heavy burden. Well, a third point here, the honest, the honesty, I spelt that word wrong, the honesty that sets us free. And this is part of the blessing of forgiveness, the honesty that sets us free. There's confession and release in verses 5 and 6. I acknowledged my sin to you, and I did not cover my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord. And you forgave the iniquity of my sin. Therefore, let everyone who is godly offer prayer to you at the time when you may be found. Surely in the rush of great waters they shall not reach him. God covers our sin. It's not our job to do that. David tried to cover his sin, and it led to further sin. But in God's remedy, God covers our sin, and it is dealt with. When David comes to acknowledge his sins to the Lord, that's when David stops hiding from God. He acknowledges his sin, he confesses his sin, but isn't this wonderful? And you forgave the iniquity of my sin. And the cross of Christ becomes a wonderful mirror for us. It shows us, when we look at the cross of Christ, we see the holiness of God, but we also see his mercy. We see the seriousness of our sin, but we also see the God who has borne our sin on the cross, that we might be honest with ourselves and honest before God. And true freedom begins when excuses end. Well, the blessing of forgiveness, it provides the refuge we never expected. We are saved and delivered from fear to safety. Verses 6 and 7. Therefore, let everyone who is godly offer prayer to you at a time when you may be found. Surely in the rush of great waters they shall not reach him. You are a hiding place for me. You preserve me from trouble. You surround me with shouts of deliverance. Well, the godly learn to quickly turn to God. And it's at a time when he may be found. Now, we can harden our hearts before God. And, I like to say that sin comes with its own anesthetic. The more we sin, the more immune and numb we become to its consequence in our life, the more deaf we become to God's voice. But when God lays his hand upon us, as he did on David, turn to him while he can be found. Because the conviction of the Spirit is meant to lead us home. It's not simply to crush us. And when we come to the Lord, we don't come to find a punishment we actually find a hiding place. Verse 7, you are a hiding place for me. We come to God in fear, but instead we find a refuge. It is the God who exposes our sin so that he might then shelter us and cover our sin. Well, my fifth blessing of forgiveness, it gives the growth that it speaks of the growth that God will accomplish in our lives. There's an easy way and there's a hard way, verses 8 and 9. I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will counsel you with my eye upon you. Be not like a horse or a mule without understanding, which must be curbed with bit and bridle, or it will not stay near you. God's now speaking. I will instruct you. God is committed to actually our growth. And we can learn willingly or reluctantly. I like the phrase that was shared to me by when I did a professional development course with Arch Hart. He said, in God's kingdom, there's no such thing as failure, only forced growth. And we can be able to learn attentive to God and learn his ways, or we can be like the ox, the horse or the mule, which has to be forced with bit and bridle. And when you have a dog, an obedient dog is a real joy. A disobedient dog, not such a joy. And you have to struggle with the lead, don't you? And most of us, I think, we kind of train our dogs to the point that we can put up with them, because we haven't able to get them to perfection. There's some dogs that can be trained better than others. We had Bernese mountain dogs, which they're just big, so 60 kilograms or so. And so when they decide that they want to pull off the lead, they can do that anytime they like. So it's very much trying to build a connection so that, Baxter, as we called one of our dogs, we called the other one Luther, would want to stay close to us. And for those trying to show these dogs and walk them around and show their obedience, it's always difficult, because when they say sit, they'll sit nicely, and then they'll just lean against you. In God's kingdom, there's no such thing as failure, only forced growth. But how better it is to be attentive to God and to walk in his ways. God will have his way with us, and it says in Hebrews, the Lord disciplines those he loves. Wisdom is learning to walk with him willingly. Well, I have one more point to make. And this is the hidden blessing of forgiveness. And it's revealed in verses 10 and 11. Because here we see that we are transformed from sinner to saint. Many are the sorrows of the wicked, but steadfast love surrounds the one who trusts in the Lord. Be glad in the Lord and rejoice, O righteous, and shout for joy, all you upright in heart. The psalm ends at the same place it began, pronouncing a blessing. Notice the transformation between verses 5 and verses 10 and verses 11. In verse 5, we have a confessing sinner who is guilty, who is burdened, who is hiding. But in verse 11, instead of a confessing sinner, we have a righteous one. Instead of a guilty person, we have a person who is upright in heart. Instead of burdened, they are singing. Instead of hiding, they are rejoicing. And I call it a hidden blessing because God's forgiveness does more than simply remove our guilt. It restores our relationship. It creates a new standing before God. And the result is not a sense of, I've failed God, I let myself down and those I love, I'm miserable. No, it ends, God's forgiveness ends in joy. Rejoice in the Lord and be glad. Glad, shout for joy. The confessing sinner, you see, becomes the righteous worshipper. Well, Nathan's words would have sounded to all those around him, to his friends and his enemies alike, when Nathan said, "You are the man," David's world collapsed. But it's not a world worth inhabiting. And David discovered that actually what seems like a defeat actually is an act of God's grace. And the hidden blessing of forgiveness is this: the sinner who comes honestly to God is not merely pardoned, he is transformed. I don't know whether you've had a moment like that where the delusion of sin that you were living in came crashing down because that voice that came through Nathan came to you. You are that man. It seems that your world is at an end. Yes, in some respects it is. But is it a world worth having? Does it mean that the rest of life is a misery? No, it isn't. The confessing sinner of verse 11 becomes the righteous and upright-hearted worshipper of verse 11. Amen.